Well, welcome everyone to this edition of Stories for Healing. You know, this has really turned into an amazing series, and it was born out of the concern about our divisions and all our antipathies and the darkness that was kind of preceding the election. And as a storyteller, I had to ask myself, what do I do? And the only thing I could think of to do is to tell stories, of course. And to tell stories, though, not of winning and losing and of I'm right and you're wrong, of which there are plenty, but instead to tell stories of healing and reconciliation, transformation and growth. And so that's what we're doing. And we're getting storytellers from around the world. We're queued up with people wanting to tell stories for at least the next 3 weeks. And it's very exciting. So that's what we're doing. And we're on Facebook Live every day. We're archived on YouTube, and you can always find us. So we're going to have a very special edition today. Jamie Mayo is telling us a story, and from the middle of the country. So Jamie, please tell us a story.
Thank you so much, Jim. And I love being able to be a part of this. This was such a wonderful idea to come up with and so needed. So today I want to tell you a story about my grandmother. And when I was a kid, I loved the holidays because every year we did the same thing. We would go over to my grandma and grandpa's house on Christmas Eve. My dad and his family, his brother and their family, and all of us kids were all about the same age. And my grandmother, Mama, she would cook for us a pork shoulder every year. Same thing. She would make slaw, and not the kind with the creamy stuff on it. This was just the vinegar, salt, and sugar slaw. And then right before we were ready to eat, she would put the buns in the oven and toast those. My dad's cousin lived in Pennsylvania, and in their backyard was a potato chip factory. And so every year, a couple of weeks before Christmas, we would get a big box of a variety of chip packages, and we would have to wait until that night to open those chips up and get to eat them. And once everything was done with dinner, we would have my grandmother's famous apple pie. And then the kids we'd go on into the living room, and we would hang out around the tree and kind of scout around the packages that were underneath. And then we'd play some games while we waited for the adults to clear the kitchen. Finally, we would get to open presents. But it was the whole thing that I loved. And that's how my childhood went. When I got older, I went off to school. Every time I came home, my grandmother would fix for me a big pot of ham and beans and her cornbread. And I have never had cornbread like hers since. I love that cornbread. And so I would go and visit with her whenever I came home within a day or two of having arrived. And I would sit in the kitchen with her while she took out all the ingredients. She would turn the oven on. She would take her cast iron skillet and oil it up, put it into the oven while it preheated. And then she would begin to pour things into the bowl. And she was that kind of cook. She did not use measuring spoons. She knew about how it looked, and she certainly knew when the right consistency was achieved. So the buttermilk, the cornmeal, the leavening, the salt, all of that. And I would just sit there and watch her. Well, my cousin, he was a little bit smarter than me, and he decided he wanted that apple pie recipe of hers. And so he went over, and every time she dumped something into the bowl, he would take it out and measure it and write it down. And so that's what I decided, that the next time I went to see my grandmother, I was going to ask her to allow me to do that with her cornbread recipe. Because this is the thing that just delighted me, how she would take that hot pan out of the oven, and she would pour the batter in, and the way that it sizzled, I loved the whole thing. She would then slide it back in, and she and I would sit around the kitchen table talking, and the aroma, that tangy buttermilk, would begin to fill the kitchen while we sat there talking to each other and catching up. And as soon as it came out, she would take a knife and just run it around the edges of that pan, and then take the spatula and underneath, she would just loosen the whole thing. Then she'd put a plate on top of it, flip it over, and pull the pan off, set it down, and then flip it onto another plate so that it was sitting up the right way. Once she'd done that, while it was still hot, she would cut me a wedge, slice it this way across the middle, and then slather it with butter. And then she would hand it to me on a napkin, and I would hold it there, and I would breathe it in. And before when I got my eyes opened up, my glasses were all steamed up. And before the steam even cleared away, I would just take a big bite of that cornbread. And the tang of the buttermilk would fill my mouth, the warmth of the butter that had melted. And there was nothing better than that. And so I had all of this in my mind when I called my grandmother a few weeks before I was to head back home. And it was the holiday time again. And she was delighted. She said, of course, that she would love to have me over and we would make a big batch of cornbread. And so I drove back down to my folks' house, and I got there and we had dinner like we do every time I head home. My mom always asks me what it is I'd like to have, and then she has it ready and waiting by the time I drive up. And the next day, well, my mom had a few errands she wanted to run, and she wanted me to come along with her. And then my dad had something, and I could feel the pull begin inside me, because I knew in the back of my mind that my grandmother was expecting me. And I could hear that little voice that I often ignore there inside my head saying, Jamie, you need to call Mama. You need to call Mama. And I kept not doing it. And finally, the sun had left the sky, and my mom and my dad were sitting in the living room, and I could hear the first strains of the Sound of Music coming on. That show that we had watched for as long as I could remember when I was growing up, right around that time of year. And I was just finishing up putting some things on their plates ready to bring their dinner into them, and for myself as well, when the phone rang. And so as I handed my mom and dad their plates, I said, I'll get that, I'm up. And so I went and I answered the phone. And I heard something, no voice, hello, hello. And it sounded almost like a sniffling, hello. And then finally, Jamie. I said, oh, Mama, are you okay? And she said, I thought you were coming over. I thought we were going to make cornbread today. And I could feel the heaviness coming across the wire, and the distress that she was in. And I was starting to form the words and before I could even begin to start stumbling into that, she started sobbing. And so I just sat and I held onto the phone and I listened as she cried. And when she could finally speak again, she said, I thought you didn't love me anymore. And I cannot tell you how the rest of that conversation went, except for to say, I told my grandmother that I would be over the next day and that we would spend the afternoon together. And that's exactly what we did. We sat there on that green and gold striped love seat that had been in her living room for as long as I could remember. And she held my hand as she flipped through some of the old picture albums. And she would point out this or that and tell me a story about when I was a kid or about when she was a kid. And I listened. And it just didn't feel right to ask if we could make cornbread that day. Just felt like I hadn't done my penance or something. And so that's how we spent the rest of that afternoon. And the next year, when I went back down to visit my family for the holidays, my grandmother was wandering in and out of her own memory. And I never did get that recipe. But I kept trying. I kept any cornbread recipe I would come across that seemed like it might be close, I would make up a batch. And as I was mixing things, I would have my cast iron skillet, the one that my grandmother had used. I would have it all oiled up and in the oven, warming while I stirred. And when I took it out and set it on top of the stove and I poured that batter in, I would hear the sizzle. And I would think of my grandmother. And then I would slide it into the oven and I would wait while while the smell of that cornbread began to fill my kitchen. And when it was finally done, I would take it out. I would take my knife, just like she had always done. And I would take my spatula underneath that cornbread and I would get it all loosened up and then I would flip it onto the plate. And then I would take another plate and flip it back over. And before it began to cool at all, I would cut myself a wedge and I would slice it right down the middle, just like my grandmother had, and I would slather it with butter. And then I would hold it there in my hands. And before the steam even cleared from my glasses, I took a bite. And even though the flavor was never right, I remembered my grandmother every time and how she loved me. And that's the story of Mama's cornbread.
Oh, Jamie, what a beautiful story.
Oh, thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
How do we heal from that pain? You know? And
Yeah.
that's because we do. We feel pain and we cause pain, and somehow we have to move beyond it. Through it, I guess, is the answer.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
You know, it reminds me of a story about a Roman emperor who had tasted a special meal in Jerusalem on the Sabbath, and he wanted the recipe, and he made sure he had all the ingredients, and it never tasted quite the same. Yeah, and it was because he didn't have the love that came with it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think you found that. I
Yeah.
think you found it. Do you make cornbread for others now?
Well, I'm not sure anybody wants to really share food much these days, but
Well, I don't mean yes. I don't mean now.
right. Actually, I went back home. My niece was married this summer, and so we had an outdoor wedding for that, and my aunt was there, and I was talking about the cornbread recipe, and she said, I think I've got that recipe somewhere. Mhm. She said, but I'm not sure it's quite right. I think maybe Mama left some key ingredient out. I've tried it a few times and it's close. So she actually sent me the recipe, and I have not shared it with others, but yeah, I think it was missing an egg. So I just threw an egg in and that was it.
That was
That
it.
was the recipe. And
Well, there
so
were two secret ingredients, and you had one of them for sure.
yeah, exactly. But yes, I have made it in the past and shared it, and people love it. But it just was never. They had never tasted Momo's.
That's right. That's right. Thank you so much. That's really, really wonderful. Well, see, folks, this is what you get if you come to Stories for Healing. This is really, really quite wonderful. I want to say that, this is the sort of thing that we can learn, not just to hear a good story, tell a good story, but how do we talk to each other? How do we share those secret ingredients with each other even when maybe there's been a rift or there's been some kind of pain between us, how do we just go back to some of the basics and say, it's time to try that one over again, because we never know when our last opportunity is going to be. So do join us. Do listen to the stories. Listen to them over and over again if you like on YouTube. And, tell stories to each other and maybe bake a little cornbread. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.